Ladies and gentlemen, here we go.
Completely my bad. I'm sorry.
What did you do, TJ? I just want to warn you, so we still have 2 minutes to start, but people can already hear and see us.
Okay, cool.
So you have to censor everything you already want to say.
Oh my God, but I never censor everything I have to say, even during the conference when people can hear me.
Okay, never mind.
I just realized it's actually a good thing that the hat thing didn't go on. I mean, I brought the cool hat, but obviously I can't wear it.
Oh yeah. Okay, so for everyone who's already in the room, we wanted to have a competition for the best hat. And we were really hoping that each of you can be on a screen, and then we wanted GJ to select person with the favorite or bestest hat. But unfortunately, with this setup, we can't see your faces, so we just trust that you're looking very cool, wearing really nice clothing, and of course, having as much fun as we have on this side of the screen. Okay, GJ, so we have 1 more minute. So I'm going to do all the house rules in about 1 minute, and we have the whole hour. So I think we're going to go for about, did you say 40, 45 minutes, and then about 15 questions at the end for the discussion?
Yeah, but do we have, does anybody have a preference as to whether we do questions kind of simultaneously as we go or at the end?
I think you as a presenter should decide, and then people can raise their hand. So maybe you can decide if you want people to be able to do it while you talk, or if it's maybe less distracting and if you want people to ask questions and have a discussion at the end.
Yeah. Basically, let's just have people raise hands as we go. And then if I realize it's too much overhead and I get too lost in the story, then we can just stop that at that moment. And then from that point on, everybody has to leave the questions to the end, something like that.
That sounds perfect. Okay, so we are spot on 10 o'clock. So welcome everyone. I'm gonna do some house rules, and I hope during that time we will have some more people joining in. We are competing with another special interest group, which is in room 1, which is on ecological momentary assessment. So first thing I would like to draw your attention to is something we started on Twitter. And it's a hashtag, which is myEHBS 2020. And it would be great to see where are you attending from. It would be super nice to see your faces. So we really encourage you to put a picture of yourself and basically just show us where you are, where are you calling in, where are you joining in. Because as much as it's great to see the presenters, it would be really nice to see people on the other side as well. So very simple rules, and this is something that we discussed right now. So if any of you has a burning question, feel free to raise hand during the talk while GJ is presenting. But if we get too many people with raising hands, and if GJ gets a bit overwhelmed, then we move on to keeping the questions for the end. And then basically the talk will feel about 40-45 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a good stimulating discussion at the end. I have very quick presentation. This is just a very brief.
Sorry, your audio just briefly dropped for me, but you're back now. So, sorry, carry on.
So this is a very brief intro to Synergy. So this is the presentation that's hosted by us. And Synergy is a subdivision of the EHBS. For those of you who don't know, we focus on advancing the field of health psychology, but bringing together expertise by sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, sharing critical evaluations. And also we aim to stimulate networking and collaborative research. We try to do it all in informal and supportive atmosphere. And one of the highlights of our year is the meeting that we organize, which is a Synergy expert meeting that usually happens every year. Unfortunately, not this year, but we really hope to have a great meeting next year. So these meetings usually aim to discuss and brainstorm a topic which is very relevant to health psychology, and we always aim to publish a summary or some sort of a consensus statement on that topical issue that we met and discussed over the 2 days that usually happens before the conference. I want to briefly introduce you to the Synergy Organizing Board. That's myself, and I have a pleasure to chair this team. I'm based in Australia and Poland. It's Jan, who is based in Germany. He's our treasurer. It's Alicia, who's in the UK. She's our secretary. We have Sebastian, who is also based in the UK, the evaluation and dissemination officer. Sinead, who is the liaison officer, currently based in Belgium. Anne, she's our engagement officer, currently based in the UK. And we also have Nicola, who is our local organizer for Slovakia. So that's the team, and that's basically people behind the Synergy. So before I pass it on to Jan, who will have a pleasure of introducing our speaker, who probably doesn't really need formal introductions, because as we know, GJ is probably one of the most colorful personalities that we have a pleasure to meet and collaborate with through EHPS. I just want to do final plug-in, which is Synergy Expert Meeting for 2021. And we will have excellent facilitators, Ryan Rhodes and Alexandra Łuszczyńska, who will convene the meeting on physical activity and family environment using system mapping approach. And we hope to all meet not around a virtual table, but we hope to be sitting around the actual table in Bratislava, but that's, as we know, yet to be confirmed. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Jan Keller, who will have a pleasure of formally introducing our speaker, GJ.
Yes, thank you, Dom. I have the honor to formally introduce GJ, a well-known member of our EHPS Society. GJ, also known as Doctor, and I hope I pronounced it correctly, Dr. Kjeld-Jan Peters. He is assistant professor at the Dutch Open University of Methods and Statistics. His research includes topics all around behavior change. One of his projects, very interesting and maybe also related to EHPS conferences, is the Dutch Nightlife Prevention Project, Celebrate Safe. He develops and maintains R packages. He also has a website, userfriendlyscience.com. Many of you might already know it. GJ published numerous papers, among others, in Health Psychology Review. He even has a company, The Greater Good. They do consultancy and training in intervention mapping. His expertise, and that's one reason why we asked him to present today. He has awesome presentation skills. His PowerPoints are a must-see for early career, but also for senior researchers. Sometimes he even presents his own research. And regarding his EHPS activities, he served the EHPS community as the web officer for 9 years, 7 years for Synergy, also a strong connection to our Synergy board, and for 2 years for the EHPS board. And he initiated very important EHPS-related channels, such as the EHPS social meetings WhatsApp group. Currently, we have 153 members, very important when the conference takes place in the cities, but also for like all topics around the EHPS and for nightlife, of course. And he also initiated the EHPS Corona Talk WhatsApp group. This is also a connection to the talk of today, an indispensable platform in the fight against COVID-19. So to sum up, the EHPS community can be very proud to have GJ as a member, and we are very happy to have him today for his talk. And yeah, the stage is yours, GJ.
Wow, thank you very much. I'm almost speechless. Fortunately, not completely. Just as a disclaimer, do you see my shared screen now? Excellent. As a disclaimer, one of the things I learned yesterday is that when you do a virtual presentation, animations often don't survive. So I'm afraid that the presentation will be slightly less animated than people might be used to. I did manage to quickly create a PDF of the slides, which I uploaded to yourrisk.com/ehps20. I'll repeat the URL at the end, so everybody can just see the slides, so you don't have to take any notes if you don't want. So this is a bit of a different presentation from what I normally do, because the idea is that it is actually a bit more like storytelling. So I did create a slide deck to kind of structure the story a bit. But that's also one of the reasons why I think that everybody can just ask questions when they want. As soon as I get overwhelmed, we can just change that method. I haven't done this as a host yet, so I'm not sure how I see questions. So if I miss anything, then one of the other moderators should maybe remind me. So Jan already just explained about the HPS social app group. That started when I was, I think, walking to the hotel with Rick after having maybe 1 or 2 drinks in Aberdeen at the conference. And then we realized that actually it would be nice if it would be easy to figure out where everybody was. So we decided to create this social app group in 2016. And it actually worked quite well. So the idea is that people can just ask where everybody is, and then other people say where they are, and then you can meet up. And that's especially nice when people are kind of, but they don't yet know many other people, because then you can quickly latch on to other groups. Just to provide some evidence, because recently in the social app group, there were some concerns as to whether I sleep. So as a proof of my responsible behavior, I decided to also show this screenshot. I'm not entirely sure the font is legible. If not, somebody should tell me. And this app group actually worked quite well during Aberdeen, but also afterwards it was useful to tell each other whether you could actually get to the airport at all or not. And we kind of rebooted it the next year for Padova. And from then on, it grew on. And as Jan said, we are now at 153 participants. But some people had quite strong ideas about whether we were allowed to discuss work in this app group. And of course, since it was related to the conference, one topic that we all found interesting is health psychology. So that led to some minor frictions. So then we decided to create another group, the HPS Work Talk group, which by now also has like 100 participants. If you would like to join any of these groups, by the way, just ask any of the Synergy board members, for example, they can let you in. The idea of the groups is that everybody is an admin, as an aside. And in the Work Talk group app, obviously, we started discussing the corona virus when it started going around the world. But some people at that point considered those discussions kind of anxiety-inducing. So we created another group, the HPS Corona Talk group. And that now has 73 participants. And in that group, at some point, there were some discussions where people actually wanted to help. There was this strong sense that we have this specific expertise as health psychologists, as behavior change experts. And it would be nice if we could actually do something to help with this crisis. That was one of the actually the main start of this Your COVID Risk project. It was mostly based on something, or the idea was mostly based on something that I came across in parallel, which was called the Pandemic Footprint Index. That's a German website available in German and English, where they just ask you a few questions, like, for example, with how many people you are in daily face-to-face contact. And then when you're done, you get your PFI footprint. In this case, I may not have filled it out completely seriously because I wanted to get to the end. Fortunately, our participants never behave like that. I got a huge footprint of 144. And then it gives you some advices, some suggestions, but mostly they were just tweets like here or links to other resources. There was not a lot of evidence of behavior change stuff. I showed that app to my partner and she said something like, oh, that's very nice. That's really cool. But of course, nobody of my friends is going to use that because it's not in Dutch. And of course, the world is big with a lot of languages. And I thought, well, since we have this EHPS group and people do want to help, it would actually be quite simple to just rebuild this thing using Lime Survey, an open source survey tool. And you can use a survey tool. You could also use Qualtrics, but it's not open source. So therefore, it violates the open science principles, so it's evil. So we could use Lime Survey, which is open source, and just build these questions and then give some answers. And then we can just translate it with all the people from this EHPS Corona group, because we probably cover a lot of countries. But then I was thinking, the intervention thing that you see at the end, well, it was basically just some links to tweets. There's got to be a better way to do this. And as those of you who attended my physical talk last year at the HPS with lots of nice animations, know, I think of interventions now in terms of causal structural change. The idea is that if you want to change any behavior, and usually when we have a target behavior, we distinguish sub-behaviors. So if you have like social distancing, so like keeping enough distance out in public, one of the sub-behaviors is that you don't approach people. Another sub-behavior is that you actually walk around people. If people approach you, you walk back, you maybe correct people. So there are lots of different actual target behaviors, sub-behaviors, that have different determinants. And each of these sub-behaviors has a number of determinants, like attitude, norms, self-efficacy, habit. But those determinants, defined at the generic level, they're not actually useful for intervening on. If you build an intervention always has very specific messages. It uses specific stimuli, it uses specific procedures, it uses specific words, etc., etc. Those have to target specific bits of people's psychology. You have to be able to understand why people do what they do at that very specific level. You have to know which expectations they have. If it's about habits, you have to know which cues cause the habits and which responses exactly are triggered. If it's about subjective norms, you have to know who the social reference are and whether it's about their behavior or their perceived approval, etc. So knowing the determinants at the generic level, at the psychological construct level, so to speak, doesn't help you much if you want to develop an intervention. You need to know the exact content. So those are the subdeterminants. Then you target those with your intervention, which is actually the application of one or more behavior change principles. Behavior change principles are a term that I launched with Rick Kritze to encompass both the behavior change techniques and the behavior change methods. So they're kind of, in that sense, school agnostic. They just cover everything that works to change a part of people's psychology. So you have these causal structural chains, and every subdeterminant kind of has its own chain. And on the right-hand side, that subdeterminant connects through the intermediate links to the target behavior. And on the left-hand side, it connects to the behavior change principle, which is why the application that implements the behavior change principle works to change the subdeterminant. So you have this causal structural chains. Those were not actually used in the message that was presented to people who used the pandemic footprint. So I was thinking, if we are going to make this and we have all this expertise, why not just improve on that and use this knowledge about how behavior change actually works? Now, of course, you don't have just one of those chains. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. To give an example, the target behavior can be, just to name a wild example, keeping 1.5 meters distance. The sub-behavior can be walking around other people. An important determinant might be attitude. A subdeterminant might be the belief, the expectation that if you walk in a circle around other people, they won't mind, they won't be offended or anything. And this could be targeted by persuasive communication, which is a behavior change principle we know from mostly experimental research can be effective to change attitude, and therefore subdeterminants of attitude, like this specific expectation. You can implement that in a cartoon, for example, and it won't work unless you make sure that you satisfy the relevant parameters for effectiveness. So in this case, one of the parameters for effectiveness of persuasive communication is that the message has to be, well, it doesn't have to be relevant, but it has to be perceived as relevant by the target population. And an intervention consists of loads of these, because obviously people's behavior isn't predicted by one of those expectations. People have loads of expectations, people have loads of representations of the world, norms, perceptions of their own skills, perceptions of barriers. So you have lots of subdeterminants, which are clustered within determinants. And the more you target, to the degree that they are relevant, the more likely your intervention is to lead to behavior change. And if this causal structural chain is broken anywhere, if you use the right behavior change principle, but you don't apply it properly, then it won't work. Then your causal structural chain you won't change the subdeterminant, and you won't change the target behavior. Similarly, if you target a subdeterminant that's not actually relevant, nothing will happen. If you don't use a behavior change principle that is able to change the relevant determinant, nothing will happen, etc. So that means you have to get all this right, if you actually want to have a chance of changing the behavior. One of the things we created, one of the tools we created to help keep track of all this and to make sure you get everything right, is the acyclic behavior change diagram, which is a visualization of the underlying logic model of your intervention. So it kind of summarizes all these assumptions you have, and it's based on a matrix, which is called the ABCD matrix, which is this. And basically, it's very simple. It's just a spreadsheet, hence my brilliant mug. It's just a spreadsheet where every column corresponds to one link of the causal structural chain. And the spreadsheet is then entered into software. It's in a Jamovi, it's in R, but there's also a free online app now where you can just upload your spreadsheet and then it creates the logic model. And this logic model is then useful to actually discuss your intervention with others or to make sure that you get everything right. So basically you just see the logic model that we, or the causal structural change. The target behavior here is to dose ecstasy within the recommendation. This is an example, still a fictional example, but still based on my own research. One of the sub-behaviors is that people don't do this if they don't decide to use a high dose of ecstasy. In this case, there are two determinants, attitude and perceived norm. Each of these has a number of subdeterminants, and this subdeterminants column is by far the most important one. This subdeterminants column decides what can change in people's minds. Everything that isn't in this column won't change. So that means that the higher this is, basically, the larger the probability that your intervention will actually do anything. Well, these subdeterminants are targeted by bits of an intervention, applications, which are kind of like tangible, like flyers or role-playing or procedures for therapy or whatever. And these only work if they implement behavior change principles, which are basically psychological principles that we figured out about how we can help people learn, how we can change those subdeterminants, how we can change their expectations, etc. So that's the ABCD, and you can use that to discuss it with target group members, stakeholders, implementers, and producers. So I thought we can actually use this because then we can create the ABCD matrix for the behaviors that we want to target in the COVID risk estimate tool. And then we can systematically also improve on them because you have one row for every subdeterminant. If over time determinant studies start surfacing and we start learning more about why people do or don't wear masks, or why people do or don't wash their hands, or why people do or don't keep distance, then it's quite easy to work on this ABCD matrix and improve the intervention. So this was another development that was happening alongside with the pandemic footprint in itself and the Corona app where people were expressing a desire to help. This was a third kind of development that was in my mind that made me think maybe this is actually feasible to do. In this causal structural chain, as I just said, the crux are the subdeterminants. You have to know what's inside people's heads. So that means if we want to do this project, we need to know about why people keep their distance or not. But we didn't know anything yet. So I thought, since I also, as Jan explained, develop R packages, I kind of think in terms of versions. So I was thinking, if we just use this first version of the tool to ask people some questions about why they do what they do, we can actually improve the second version. And then a nice benefit is that we get this insight into these determinants that we can then use to advise, to recommend governments, etc. A problem here is that if you want to do something like this internationally, it would be nice if those psychological constructs, those determinants exist. That you can say, that you can talk about attitude, and it's always the same attitude, regardless of whether you're trying to measure it for physical activity in a sample in München or for condom use in New Orleans or for social distancing in Delhi. So I recently, we published a paper where we explained that these determinants don't actually exist like that. Rather, they are much more constructivistic. They're like metaphors that we use to think about human behavior. But a consequence of the fact that they don't exist the same way that this mug exists is that there are a lot of different definitions. And the definitions that we have are already not very clear. So if you look at the definitions of self-efficacy, for example, there was a nice paper recently, the confounded self-efficacy construct, which discussed exactly the problems around defining and clearly conceptualizing self-efficacy, and of course, perceived behavioral control, the very related concept. This is not unique to health psychology. Basically, all over psychology, our measurement is, to put it euphemistically, a complete mess. And that's related to the fact that our definitions are often a complete mess. A very nice illustration, I think, is the measurement instruments for major depression. So Eiko Fried looked at, I think, 6, 7 measurement instruments for depression, and he found basically that they all measure different symptoms. There's quite some overlap, but there's also a lot of non-overlap. And that's depression. That's like a big problem that's much clearer to define than something like intrinsic motivation. So on the one hand, the definitions aren't clear. On the other hand, related to this, measurement varies greatly. That's of course very tricky if you want to do something, do a project, and if you want to ask your tool users in lots of languages questions about why they do what they do, and you want to use this to improve the tool to build a better intervention, then you have to make you have to have some way to make sure that you're actually measuring the same constructs in all those languages. Fortunately, since we wrote that paper, pragmatic nihilism paper, about how variables don't actually exist the way we treat them, we've also been thinking about how to do this. And one of the solutions we came up with are decentralized construct taxonomies. I'll explain that really cool name in a second. The idea is that they help you to coherently work with constructs with exactly the same definition and consistently with the definition, elicit qualitative data, code qualitative data, code measures in systematic reviews, because usually if you've ever done a systematic review, you'll recognize this. Often people say we measure knowledge, but actually it's attitude or risk perception. So you usually have to recode their measures. For developing measurement instruments for a given behavior, and of course for studying or applying behavior change principles when you develop an intervention. All of those should be about the same thing. If we have a qualitative study, and in that qualitative study people study attitudes regarding keeping one's distance, then the conception of attitude that the researchers in that study use has to be exactly the same as the conception of attitude that's used in quantitative determinant studies, and it has to align with the studies that study methods to change attitude. Because if those are a little bit different, then obviously we can't expect the experimental studies into manipulations of attitude to be able to provide useful information to target the content of attitude that we identified in a quantitative determinant study. So these have to align in some way. The name is based on the fact that science works well when there is some degree of variety, especially since these constructs, like attitude and norms, don't actually exist. If we would be studying trees, then it would be useful to create one authoritative central taxonomy. And even then you could have discussions, but it would be much less controversial than with psychological constructs. In our case, there is no attitude in our head. So that means that any definition we come up with, even if we all, I can't see how many people we are anymore. If we were now all to agree on a definition of attitude, I can guarantee you that's not actually what attitude is. It would still be wrong. It wouldn't actually correspond properly to an actual latent attribute in our mind. So other research groups working with different definitions could still be very useful in learning about how attitude actually really works. So it's important for any kind of attempt to calibrate the way we do research to allow for decentralization, to stay away from one curated database. And of course, it has to be about constructs, so we have to have a construct and we have to clearly define the construct and make sure that everything else you do aligns with this. And it's called a taxonomy because it allows you to identify those constructs. It has instructions for developing measurement instruments, for example, for coding measurement instruments, or for coding aspects, for coding qualitative data. And that's basically what a taxonomy does. It helps you to look at a little bit of the world and to identify what it is, consistent with a specific definition. So these decentralized constructs taxonomies are actually just what you see here. Basically, they don't consist of anything more than a label, a definition, a unique construct identifier, and instructions for creating measurement instruments, coding measurement instruments, eliciting qualitative content, and code qualitative content. This was something that we could use in this project if we want to develop a tool. And if we want to use the tool to also try to improve the tool itself by asking people why they do what they do, these DCTs, decentralized construct taxonomies, would allow us to do this in a calibrated way across languages. Because then we were sure that the translators and the researchers working in every language worked from exactly the same definition and were applying exactly the same instructions for developing measurement instruments. And one last piece of the puzzle was that I happened to know one or two pieces of technology that we could leverage to actually feasibly do all this for free. So mostly for this project, we used Slack for communication and Google Documents for writing instructions. And then the rest kind of will come along later on. The bunch of cool looking things in the right-hand corner are R packages. And one of these we actually developed during this project, which I'll get to later. So when we kind of thought through all this, we discussed it with the board of the Academy of Behavior Change. That's a Dutch foundation aiming to kind of improve the quality of behavior change intervention development in the Netherlands, or actually globally. Because if we were to do this project, and I prefer doing stuff decentralizedly, but still it needs to have one kind of home. And I've worked at universities for long enough to know that if you want to do something like this, their infrastructure generally doesn't support quick developments, kind of like rapid, lean, agile processes. So we'd have to do it somewhere outside the more archaic university infrastructure. Also, this kind of avoided any discussions about ownership, because universities have resources, but they also don't always get to the open science thing yet, where they shouldn't try to own stuff. So we discussed it with the board of the Academy of Behavior Change, and the board agreed to actually be the formal parent of this project. And then we asked everybody in the Corona WhatsApp group what they thought. And people were quite enthusiastic. People were actually way more enthusiastic than we had expected. That might have to do slightly with the fact that we were perhaps a bit over optimistic about how quickly we'd get everything done. So when we started this, we thought, okay, you know, we created all this. Basically, all we have to do is just create some questions for you to estimate people's risk, get some idea of what kind of risk estimate to attach to those questions. Then we ask some questions about why they do what they do, basically to map determinants for a behavior or two. Well, we put it all in Lime Survey, we translate it, and done. So we thought a few hours, you know, a few evenings work translating should be fun, is very feasible. That kind of got out of hand. And now we have over 100 volunteers who are involved in the project. These are all the volunteers. I won't name any names, not because anybody wants to stay anonymous, because then I wouldn't put their pictures here. Although, as you see, some people didn't actually put their picture. I won't name any names because I just can't name everybody and do justice to the work that everybody did. So I decided to just not name everybody, even where it might be obvious. So if you are listening and you were involved and you don't hear your name, that's the reason. But all these people basically contributed a lot, and there are even many more people who contributed. Because in one of the phases, we got a lot of information from virologists and epidemiologists on the actual risks. And not all of those ended up filling out the survey that created this page. So in the end, we created this. I'll briefly walk you through it to show what we're actually talking about, and then I'll explain a bit about the background and the process. So this is the website. It might look a bit empty, but one of the reasons for that is that it's actually what they call mobile first. So the website was created to work primarily on mobile phones. This is a screenshot from my phone. So as you see, it's kind of like high and thin. Most mobile phones in the world currently have a resolution of 360 by 640 pixels. So that means that we try to optimize for relatively low resolution phones. The idea is that people go to the website and they can click the button to find out their risk. Then they indicates the country, which we used to give some idea of the risk estimate. Some countries have higher prevalence than others. They indicated their age. We very deliberately designed all this to make sure that we would not collect any personal data as defined in the GDPR. For those of you not in Europe who maybe missed the GDPR is an excellent legislatory framework, maybe even a law, but it's European. Okay, so anyway, it's something legal, and it's great because it actually very clearly defines when you are allowed to process other people's personal data. It also means that you have a lot of responsibilities when you process other people's personal data, which makes sense, but it's also a pain if you're a processor, so it's usually best avoided. One of the ways to avoid it is to have a wide sampling frame, and another way to avoid it is to have very low resolution in your questions. Hence, we have large bandwidths here for age. And then we measured a number of behaviors, and we tried to make this as simple as possible, because the idea is that we wanted this to be usable by a wide variety of people. So we tried to minimize the scales here. We didn't actually manage that later on, but for here, we still managed to minimize the scales. So usually the pages had only one question. Sometimes they had two questions. And we very aggressively tried to keep the number of questions to a minimum so that people would actually get to the end of the tool. Because of course, it's a bit more about the intervention at this point than about the actual risk estimate, because the risk estimate doesn't change any behavior. People need to know what they need to do. After we asked people about their behavior, we asked whether they were willing to answer questions to help improve the tool. And those were the questions that used the DCTs, the decentralized construct taxonomies, to make sure that we measure subdeterminants in a way that works the same for all the countries. And these created questions like these. So these are typical attitude questions. These are instrumental attitude. So basically you measure an expected consequence of the behavior, and you measure whether people find that consequence pleasant or unpleasant. Well, this is another one. As you see here, this is a bidimensional scale with slightly different colors. The reasoning behind that is that it would hopefully minimize measurement error by people interpreting bidimensional scales as unidimensional and vice versa. Well, I selected 8 questions, so I get about 4 pages. And then people get their risk estimate. It looks like this. I'll get back to this risk estimate later. And they get their so-called safety estimate, which is basically our estimate for how they could stay safe, which is the intervention. So it's tailored messages that target specifically what we think is the most important for them based on their behavior. Because of course, for these people, we don't know the determinants. We just measured a few determinants if they were willing to answer those questions, but mostly we know their behavior. So this is mostly tailored based on their behavior. So this was translated in about 22 languages, and it's available in about 30 countries. So as you see here, the process kind of grew a bit out of hand. And that was one of the most challenging things maybe to, because we had kind of built everything to be scalable, but we also had to scale everything, of course. And that was kind of not always obvious to do. So I'll tell a bit about the background. We started with creating the risk model, and to create the risk model, a lot of risk factors were extracted from the literature. There was a recent review, which was very useful. And then these risk factors were judged by epidemiologists and virologists to get risk estimates on the same scale. And then we clustered those to create a tree so that we could figure out what actually the most important behaviors and factors were that we had to measure. Because we can't measure all these in the risk estimation questions in the beginning of the tool. We had to have a selection. And this was already way too much, so we selected the top 50% and then clustered it a bit, and then it became a bit more manageable. And then we colored it depending on the risk associated. And here you can see, for example, that not washing your hands with soap was clearly deemed one of the more risky factors in the entire list by the experts we consulted. So based on this, we had another number of risk estimation questions. And then we had to get risk estimates associated to those risk estimation questions. So for this, we had a second, well, not hardly a study, but a second kind of expert consultation. where we asked virologists, epidemiologists, etc., but also people from health psychology, as you see in the second column here, to estimate the risk people ran in those different categories when they gave different answers. And we also had a number of fictional people, which were created for another study, the vignette study, to test whether the questions we asked were the right questions. And for those fictional people, which each had a specific profile, we completed the tool and then computed which risk category they would get. Because you can compute those risks, of course, and then we can aggregate them in some way, but then you have to think about how to present them. And the feedback we got from people who have a lot of experience piloting this kind of stuff with, for example, low literacy people, was that it didn't benefit them, quite the opposite, if you have too many categories. So the advice was to keep the number of categories very low, 3, maybe 4. So we had to figure out how many categories we could use while we still gave some impression of people's risk. This is the vignette study that we did. So this is a scenario of one of the people, a young single male, 23 years old, living alone, with parents living nearby, etc. These vignettes were then used to let people, mostly the experts ourselves, estimate whether the categories we use and the questions we ask people to estimate their risk would actually gauge their risk properly. And fortunately, the conclusion was that it did. Fortunately, because the whole process, I kind of tell it linearly now, but it was quite parallelized. So that means that we had very limited room for changing things. Once we had all this clear, we had to think about the risk estimate. And taking into account all the considerations, we ended up with these risk estimates. So basically, there's a little person here, and the little person kind of represents a sort of gauge. And the higher the gauge, the more risk the person has. The problem here is that you want to stay away from inducing any kind of anxiety in case people have high risk. You also want to stay away from giving a false sense of security in case people had a low risk. And you don't want to have too many categories, and you definitely don't want to give any numbers, because even though we used a lot of experts, there's no way we could justify the exact numbers that came out of the test. So using all these constraints, we ended up with these pictures. It turned out in the end that they were not always easily understood by everybody. So this is something that we want to change in a future version. Then we had another track. As you may have seen earlier, we had like over 100, maybe 140 Google documents created during the process. Many of them with explanations like these, and many of them with spreadsheets like these. So we asked everybody from every language to translate a number of template questions created based on the DCTs. So the idea was that through this process, people could look at the exact definition of the construct and the instructions for creating measurement instruments, and then combine that with these template questions to create default translations that could then later on be used to easily translate all the actual questions that we would get. So after this, we had like a set of default questions for every language that ideally were synchronized, calibrated between countries. Then, of course, we needed to know what we would need to measure and which target behavior. So we thought about the target behavior, and after that process, we decided to focus on keeping distance, keeping 1.5 meters or 1 meter or 2 meters distance. So then we asked everybody, list why you think people do or don't keep their distance in this list. So everybody, all 100-something experts, added what they thought was important in this list. And then through, as you can see at the bottom, at the tabs, 6 rounds of curation, Rick and me went through all these in a few rounds to look for similar ones, to eliminate ones that were not actually captured by the RAA DCTs that we had, to see whether we could merge some, to get to a short list of final actual subdeterminants to measure. It's important to realize that all these were here because they were deemed important. I'll get back to that later. And then we got like a long list of subdeterminants. I think we had 276 in the end, which were then translated to all of the languages. Another parallel track was the intervention development. And the intervention development used the ABCD matrices as a structure. So the idea was to think about the target behavior. We had 3 target behaviors that were identified during the risk model building as most important. Those were keeping distance, self-isolating, and hand washing. So that means we have 3 ABCDs, 3 parts of the intervention that each involved one behavior. So these were created, and in this case they also were tailored. So you see at column H, basically the rightmost column, you see the Lime survey relevance. So a description of when this message should be presented to a specific tool user. And then these matrices could be fed into the tool, and then you get these ABC diagrams, the diagrams themselves. As you might or might not be able to read, in the middle you have a subdeterminant called judging how far distrec is. And distrec is basically a code that was replaced by the recommended distance in the country where the person was located. So one of the things we also did was make an inventory of all the different recommended distances in all the countries in the world as far as we could see. If we couldn't determine it, we used the WHO standard of 1 meter. All the distances, and then all those distances were also translated to all the languages. Because of course, if somebody is in the Netherlands, they might not use the tool in Dutch, they might also use the tool in Russian. So we needed to have the Dutch distance in Russian as well. And this was then filled in by Lime survey in the questions. So these were the ABCDs, the actual diagrams showing the intervention logic underlying all of the parts of the intervention that people were shown at the end. The country list. We also translated all of the countries to all the languages, because of course, if people were using the tool in a specific language, they should still be able to find their country. And we didn't only translate them, we also had a script to download from updated prevalence estimates, so that we could use these and update the tool all the time with up-to-date prevalence estimates, so that the risk estimate adjustment for the country where people were located was actually up to date. A Lime survey theme was developed by a number of Lime survey experts, and that allowed us to have this mobile first experience that worked very well for mobile phones in the Your COVID-19 Risk style. This style was also developed for free by a designer that one of us knew. And this theme also included this ability to specify whether a scale was unidimensional or bidimensional, using colors from the so-called Viridis palette, which is optimized to be clearly distinguishable for people with different types of color blindness as well. The website was coded, and that basically just looks like the website. But the cool thing about this website was that it was a so-called static website, which means that it basically just consists of these files. You can also run it locally on your computer. It doesn't, like many other websites, like for example WordPress, require the server to run a programming language. It's just a set of files. And this allowed us to have the configuration specified in so-called JSON files like this. This looks a bit messy, but if you clean it up, it looks kind of like this. And that allowed us to have different versions for the tool. As you see here at the top, the primary language of this version of the site was set to English, and the tool URL has this tool URL, and it has a number at the end, which is the version of the tool. This was version 1.21 of the tool. This allowed us to have scripts that read in all those Google spreadsheets that we had, with all the different text for the website and all the translations, to read those into R and then write them into the website directly, so that we could automatically update the website from the Google spreadsheets. So that meant that everybody, all the volunteers working in the project, could basically just work in the spreadsheets or in the, well, actually just in the spreadsheets, which is a format that everybody is used to. And they didn't have to actually worry about updating the website or working with any kind of website interface. And neither did we. Basically, we just had to code this code so that R would automatically do the updating for us. One of the things we had to develop was this Liminate R package, which is an R package that allows you to programmatically create Lime survey surveys. Because we had all these translations for this Lime survey survey that became quite large. I think the file is now like 60 megabytes. And that's not something you want to manually do pointing and clicking in the Lime survey or Qualtrics interface. You want to create this well, let a computer create it for you. And this allowed us to do just that. So basically, we could read all those determinant mapping questions that we created earlier on and translated earlier on, then create the survey, and then we could save the whole thing to different versions, which we could then import directly into Lime Survey. Another tricky thing was the hosting, because when we started, we saw that this pandemic footprint index thingy had like millions of page views and 100,000 page views in one day. So we thought, man, if that happens for a website that's only available in German and English, then what's going to happen if we are available in Hindi and Chinese, etc. So fortunately, we could use something called Netlify for the hosting, which was convenient, and Lime Survey themselves also offered us free hosting, so that we were quite confident we could deal with that. This is an example of Slack, where we had like our 116 channels, and our all our communication happened with lots of emojis, as you see. And here you see the activity. And you can see from March 23, when we started, during the beginning, there was a lot of activity until kind of like end of May, when we had launched in most countries, but not all countries. Here you can see how many tool users at this moment we have in different countries in the world. And you can see that that differs a lot. So some countries like Romania, Belgium, New Zealand, UK and the Netherlands have a lot of tool users. But in some countries like Australia, it's a bit lower. And this turned out to be a function very much of the degree to which you happened to get an in at media. If you happened to talk to a journalist and you had like a newspaper article or something, then tool use would spike a lot. That's also what you can see here in the accumulation of tool use. So you can see in the beginning, nothing happened. Then at some point we got in the newspaper in the Netherlands and there was a spike. Then at some point in New Zealand, there was media attention and there was a spike. But as long as there's no media attention, there's basically no tool use. You also see this skewness reflected in the tool users per country. So we have like results, like we can see how many tool users from different age groups we have from the different countries. But the most important thing for us are these determinant mapping questions, which we could use to develop it, to improve the next version. And we presented these primarily as cyberplots, which I won't go into now, but which are basically what you should use instead of regression analysis if you want to estimate the relative determinant importance. But these were quite overwhelming because, as you can see here, we have like 4 types of determinants. Those have subdeterminants, like attitude has instrumental attitude and experiential attitude. And those have like sub-subdeterminants, like the expectation and the evaluation, and the so-called belief, the multiplication of those two. So there are a lot of cyberplots for every country. And this turned out to be quite overwhelming also for us, especially for like health agencies of governments. So we decided to do something that's actually very bad practice. We basically just created tables where we ranked them. And we did rank them in 3 ways, based on the correlation, but also based on the potential for change, which is a brilliant summary of the potential for change in a determinant, either in a sample or in a person, devised by Keegan, which I also can't go into now, but it's really useful. So we sorted by those 3 indicators. And then we decided to take the top few and discuss them and present them to the government. What's very important is that there were quite a lot of these subdeterminants that turned out to not actually be important for whether people keep their distance. And that's really important to realize because this whole list of subdeterminants is only here because our group of experts compiled it as a list of subdeterminants that they deemed important. So I think even more important than finding out the most important ones is finding out the whole list of things that are intuitively important but actually are not important. So we are now working on the intervention recommendations, which is almost done, where we basically reduced everything to this list with the top 20 of subdeterminants that should be targeted. So that's kind of like the summary of the tool. So we have the tool, there are the 10 risk estimation questions, depending on how many people want to answer, 0 to 20 questions about determinants. Then we present people with the risk estimate and then with the intervention. And from the get-go, I was very clear to everybody that everything has to be open. So also the Lime Survey theme all our logos, etc., also the data, also the R scripts, everything is open and publicly accessible and has been publicly accessible since the moment we started. So if you want to play with any of these, and again, this PDF is available and I'll show you the URL. Oh, actually the URL is in the screen right now. If you want to play with the data or look at the R scripts or whatever, you can visit our Git repositories. Those are the second and the third link. The top link is the presentation. And the data are in the public domain. So you can basically just seriously do with it whatever you want. So just to kick off the discussion, because there haven't been any questions yet, unless I just completely missed them, but then we'll do them now anyway. I summarized some challenges and lessons learned. One of them is that piloting is really, really, really important. We piloted quite extensively, but we couldn't pilot everything. And even the things we did pilot, we got some feedback later that we could have caught perhaps when we had piloted even more. Another important lesson is the bus factor. We could do this because I happen to be able to connect all these technologies to each other. But that also means that I'm probably the only one with like a full overview of the ICT side of the project. And since it's an ICT heavy project, that's risky. So that means that if I have a very busy period outside of this project, everything kind of stops. So that's a big problem. And then we get to the more interesting things, I think. One is the cultural differences in question acceptability. One of the questions was that we wanted to ask people whether they wanted to become infected. Because, for example, in the Netherlands, some people wanted to become infected because the idea was back then, in March, April, that if you were infected, hopefully you were just immune. So people thought, I'd rather become infected now because now the ICs are still relatively empty, and then at least I can just continue to work and there's no more hassle. But in some countries, this was considered very sensitive, something you couldn't ask people because it was seen as something very destructive and something potentially destructive to others around you. So there were a lot of discussions about this. And another thing that was really interesting, I think, is that the longer we were busy, the more I realized that we are actually not doing research at all here. We are just building a tool to help the world. And we're asking questions, and we are researchers, so it's obvious to frame this as research. But it's not actually research. We don't have any research questions. We don't actually have any theory we're testing. We're basically just building a tool and improving it. Just like Amazon does A/B tests, experiments, RCTs, basically, all the time. So basically, you get to their website, and then, depending on the day or whatever, you get to see a different version of the website, and then they test your behavior afterwards to see what you buy. Those generally don't require ethical approval. But should those? And where exactly is this line between being a company or being a foundation or an association and asking your users questions to doing science? So those are some thoughts I wanted to end with to kick off the discussion. And that was my presentation. Does anybody have any questions or any thoughts about any of these questions that I have on the slides?
Thank you so much, GJ. Fascinating presentation, and thanks to everyone who volunteered on the project. Fantastic efforts. And I think also every time when you said free tool, open access, free tool, I think it really emphasized that gathering data and doing research doesn't have to be as expensive as it is currently. So here's one question from Matti. And Matti, I also want to say a huge thank you to you for posting all the links to the resources that GJ was mentioning. So question for Matti is, was every person show a random subset of 200-ish determinant mapping questions in the 20 questions they were presented? I don't know if you can see the question, GJ.
No, I can't. I don't know why, because I should be like a host now, right? Maybe I can. No, I can't maximize print video. No, I can't.
So
I guess it's because I'm sharing screen. But if you read the questions,
you can actually switch off your screen sharing, so then everyone can see your face a bit more.
Yeah, that's important. Let's see, stop share. Oh, wait a second.
And then also you had comments from Robert. So initially he commented on your shirt. He really likes it. Then he commented on your presentation. He likes it also. He would like also to know if he would be able to share the PowerPoint later.
Yeah. So to get to Matti's question. So yes, they were presented randomly, which was actually not trivial to program. So if you have questions about how to do that in Lime Survey, then I'll happily talk to you about it. But yeah, basically, we did pair them. So whenever we ask somebody's expectation, we also ask the evaluation. So we didn't completely randomize it, but apart from that, we had like 190 pages or whatever, and people randomly got presented with a subset of those. And well, as I said, I'll actually post the link to the so the presentation is here. Ah, yes, perfect. Thank you, Jan. As a PDF. I will not share the PowerPoint because I had to put some boxes over some people's names in the WhatsApp screenshots I used. And if I post a PowerPoint, then you can take those away, and then they're no longer anonymized and GDPR, etc. So you'll have to make do with the PDF version, I'm afraid.
Wonderful, but that's very helpful anyway. I'm very aware of the time. We only have 1 minute left. So I think if anyone has questions to GJ, you will have to follow him up via Twitter, via email, or any other ways. I just want to quickly plug in another session led by Synergy. That's on Thursday at 4 p.m. And that's what could I gain from attending Synergy and why should I take part in a future. It's going to be a very informal discussion when we will have some people who led Synergy team and also participated in a Synergy in the past. And in about 30 seconds in room 1, we will have another presentation about COVID and how health psychology can inform policy. So I would like to encourage all of you to give GJ thumbs up or virtual clap. And once again, I would like to thank you to you, GJ, on behalf of Synergy. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Bye.